Welcome to this series on learning to use 3D LUT Creator, a very powerful way to work with color. And in this video, we're going to start actually using the program to make some changes to colors in photographs. If you'd like to see the introductory video I did giving a tour through the software, I'm going to leave a link to that up above. And I assume that by this time you've set the preferences within the software. If you haven't, or if you would like to see my review of what preference settings I suggest, I'm going to leave a link to that video up above as well. So today we're going to get started with using the A-B grid, which is really one of the primary ways to adjust color. Let's get at it. So today we're finally going to get started using 3D LUT Creator. And I'd like to start with the A-B grid because it's really quite a powerful tool. And I use it and the CL grid most of all. Now, when you open the program, you're first presented with the Channel tab, and we're going to come back to the Channel and the Volume tab and all the others. But let's start with AB, and to bring that up, we're just going to click on the AB tab. Now, I don't know if any viewers played the computer game Myst in the 1990s, but working in 3D LUT Creator sort of feels like that game to me, like you're entering a room, and you know there's lots of hidden secrets if you can just find them and then figure out how to use them. And that's just what we're going to start doing in this video series, is looking at all the things in the room and figuring out how to use them. So let's bring a photo into the program and then review the things we can see and do in this grid. So I'm going to hop over to Photoshop, and I have a photo already opened. Now, this photo has actually already been fully processed, but that's fine. You know, you can still demonstrate all the things that we can do in the AB grid on a processed photo and, apply that to photos that we may not have processed yet. So let's start with this. Now, when we bring a photo over, you don't have to worry about flattening it or changing around the layers. When the photo comes over into 3D LUT Creator, it will come over with the effect of all the layers that are visible applied to the image. So you can see how this image looks here. We're going to hop over to 3D LUT Creator, and we're going to come right down here to this tab that says Image from Photoshop, and we're going to click on that, and that'll bring the image from Photoshop right over, and you can see it looks the same. Just to show you, here's the Photoshop image, and here's the image in 3D LUT Creator. Okay, so before we start playing with things, let's just have a look around and see what we have here. It always helps to know what the controls all mean before we actually start moving things around. I'm going to start at the bottom because that's actually pretty easy. This panel here is for video. And since we're not discussing video in this set of tutorials, we can just ignore that. This panel here has to do with global changes that you can make to the photograph. Now, my philosophy is that I do my basic color temperature correction and brightness and contrast in Lightroom or Photoshop before I bring the photograph in. So I don't really ever have to use this except for maybe some small tweaks. But anything that you do here is not going to be local adjustment. This is all global. So for example, if I was to turn the saturation up, you see everything gets saturated. If you want to make it back to 0, you can double click it. Same with all these controls. Again, we want to make a small global tweak here, that's fine, but I do most of my correction in Photoshop or Lightroom. So there's really not too much going on down here that we're really going to use very much. Now, we should know what these controls are up here. Let's say I made a change, and we'll discuss what these points and changes are. But if I decide I don't like that change, or I want to reset the entire grid, this circular icon resets the grid. What are these things? Well, this turns the grid into a tic-tac-toe board look, a square look. I don't particularly find that helpful. I prefer to work in the circular mode. So by clicking here, we can go right back to the circular mode. This number here tells us how many spokes we have in this wheel. And by making adjustments, we can change the number of spokes. Now, by increasing the number of spokes in the wheel, what we're doing is allowing ourselves to make finer adjustments to the color. But it can start to get a little complicated and messy looking. I think 12 or 16 for most photographs is fine. If you have situations where you need to do finer control, you can increase the number of spokes. We're going to reset. We come over here to smoothing. If you make very drastic changes and start to get some banding, which actually isn't very common using 3D LUT Creator because the changes that it makes tends to be really very smooth. But in the rare instance where you do get some banding, if you click once or twice on smoothing, it will tend to smooth out the changes that you've made. Pin all, what's that? What's pinning? Well, these points, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, can be moved. Now, if I grab this point here and move it, you can see that the entire spoke is moving along with it. If I were to click on Pin All these points now become as large as these squares that were at the tip of the spokes, and they're pinned in position so the neighbors don't follow along with them. So if I wanted to make this point different, the whole spoke no longer moves, just the individual point. Let's reset that. And again, we're going to talk about points and how to pin and not pin and what it all means. But this is just a way to pin all the points at once. Double is a very powerful tool. I'll probably discuss it in the next video on the AB grid. But what it lets us to do, just as a sneak preview, is it divides the grids into two. And you can use one grid to make color adjustments only to the shadows, and another grid to make color adjustments to the highlights. And using this slider, you can determine where the highlight and shadow pivot point is. Again, that's after we find out how to use the grid in general, but it's really an amazing tool. We'll cover that later. So now let's take a look at the star of the show here. This whole big thing, which looks like a color wheel, and in fact it is a color wheel. And you can see that as we move around the wheel, the hue changes. We go from red to magenta to purple to blue, cyan, greens, and yellows. And in the center of the wheel are neutrals and very unsaturated colors. And as we move out along the spoke, the color becomes more and more saturated as we get to the outer limits of the wheel. There is also a little hidden trick about changing brightness, which we'll get to when we demonstrate how to use this wheel. But again, that's one of these undocumented things that I hope to show you that you don't find in the usual documentation. Now, you can also see there's a fan of white here. What does that mean? The white is displaying all the colors in our photograph here. So as you might expect, there's a good deal of red and green and yellow, but not so much purple and blue and cyan, and that's why we don't see any white here. So on the color wheel, these are all the colors in our photograph. Now, if I were to go and put my cursor in the photo, say for example over this portion of green grass, we now see two icons in the color wheel, an X and a square. The X represents the exact point of color underneath the cursor, and the square indicates the point closest to it that we can use to adjust that particular color. So let's have some fun now and start using the program to make some mild adjustments and some larger adjustments in color. So if I take my cursor and run them over these red leaves, you can see in the color wheel, looking at the square and the X, which we talked about, that most of the red leaves are on this spike here, and that's not unexpected because, and you can see it's the red on the color wheel. So how do we know exactly which color? If you don't, if you want to see what the total area of color affected is, I'm going to select this point, and I'm going to talk about point selection next week because this is a lot at once, but I'm just going to do it without explaining it here. I am going to select all the points on this spoke. And just like in Photoshop, if you hold down the Alt key and click when you're making adjustments to the black and white point, you can see what's being affected. The same thing is true here. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and left click on this point, on all the points that I have selected, and you can see the area in the photo that is going to be affected if I move this spoke, because all these points, the sum total of all these points control all these colors. I'm going to deselect the points. If I wanted to see what just one point controls, again, I can Alt click on that point, and you can see that doesn't control much. If I go to this point, not there. Obviously, a lot of color is going to be here, so let's go there. And you can see we're starting to get all the colors in that tree, all the various levels of red saturation, because remember, saturation goes along this line. I'm going to deselect all these points. Now, we know the red is on this spoke. If I take this spoke and move it slightly to the left, the reds will become a little more orange if you wanted to make mild changes. If I were to move it to the right, they become more red. If I was to go downwards towards the center of the wheel, I'm going to be decreasing the saturation of the red. If I were to go up, I'm increasing the red saturation. Let's say I was to take this point and move it all the way over here into the greens. Those reds are now going to become green. And fall has gone away. Well, there's the oranges and the yellows, but the reds have now become green trees. And again, we can adjust and decrease the saturation of the greens. We can increase the saturation of the greens to make them look however we want. And what I've done is all the colors controlled by that spoke have now become the colors where I've moved that spoke to. I'm going to reset that. Let's say you just wanted to, you liked the colors where they were and you just wanted to decrease the saturation. Well, as I mentioned, we can move it along towards the center of the circle. But there's also these sliders down here. Now remember, this was a global change. These are not global changes. These are changes related to the point that is selected. So I've selected this point. There's now a square box around it indicating that it's selected. Again, we're going to go over, selecting points next week. And now when I go over saturation, I get a double-headed arrow, meaning I can go left or right. So if I hold down my left mouse key and go left, the saturation decreases without the hue changing whatsoever because it's going straight down that spoke without moving off the spoke. I can decrease the saturation or increase the saturation with very fine control. And I can reset it. Likewise, if I wanted to change the hue without changing the saturation. So let's say I turn the saturation down to here. And the saturation staying the same would be the same radius away from the center of the wheel. So I can change the hue without changing the saturation. And again, I can reset all of these changes. Now, I did mention that there was a way of changing brightness or luminance, and we can do that right here. This is only going to affect, let's pick this point because it'll be easier to see because it affects more. If I had multiple points chosen, it would affect all the points, but again, I'm not showing how to choose multiple points till next week. But this one point, I can slide and change the brightness. As you can see, we can make it darker or brighter. The colors affected by that one point or controlled by that one point. I've reset it. And here's another trick. If I hold down the Shift button and click the left mouse, I can do it right here. I can make it brighter or darker. The color is controlled by that point. Let's reset everything. Now I'm going to show you one other interesting example. So for this example, I am going to make a new LUT. I'm going to throw away anything we've done so far. And the way to do that is new preset or Control N will do it as well. It asks me if I want to start afresh, and I can say OK. In Photoshop, I happen to have this picture that my friend Bob Egan took of me 10 years ago. See, I didn't have any gray hair back then, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. I'm going to leave this photo open, and I'm going to go to 3D LUT Creator, and we are going to import the image from Photoshop. Now, if I run my cursor over the blue shirt, you can see that, not surprisingly, this area here is where all the blue color lies, and it's saying that right here is the closest control point. So if I were to grab this control point and move it, look at that. I can change the color of my shirt to whatever I would like it to be. And look at the great job that it's doing. I mean, it is really just changing the color of the shirt, and it's doing so within all the tones. So if I started with a blue shirt and I wanted to end up, say, with a, I don't know, let's say a red shirt, reddish. Yeah, I don't like a red shirt. Let's say a green shirt. There we go. And to save the work, all I need to do is come right down here and click LUT to Photoshop. So if I wanted to save the LUT to use again in the future, I could click this button and save it to one of my folders. But if I click LUT to Photoshop, it sends the instructions I just wrote in this adjustment layer to change my shirt to green. Blue, if I turn it on, it's green. So I thought that was a pretty neat example as well. So let's go back to 3D LUT Creator and reset our grid and just briefly review what it is we've done today. So we've seen that down here, this is the way we save our work. We can either save the LUT to a folder so we can use it again. We can export the LUT as an adjustment layer to Photoshop. And of course, this button is to bring the image in from Photoshop to work with it. We've seen that this panel is related to video, and we don't have to worry about it. This panel makes the same sort of changes as Lightroom or Photoshop in a global way. This circular icon resets the grid. This determines the shape of the grid. This determines how many spokes in the grid. If we get any banding, this allows us to smooth it. This pins all the points, and we are going to be talking about that next week. And this, which we'll also talk about next week, divides the grid into shadows and highlights. This is the drop-down menu we don't have to worry about right now. This is our main workspace with the color wheel, with hue going around the wheel. saturation going along the spoke of the wheel, less saturated and more saturated. And if we have points selected, we've seen that we can change the hue without changing the saturation, change the saturation without changing the hue, and change the luminance or brightness. Not exactly the same thing, but we'll just consider them the same thing for now. Well, as you can see, I changed into a green shirt. Or did I do it in 3D LUT Creator? Hard to know. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. We'll see you next time.